Hi, and welcome to Condemned and Happy Podcast, a podcast for religious trauma survivors and those who care for them. My name is Kim, and I am an ordained pastor in the ELCA, a more liberal branch of the Lutheran denomination. Joining me today is Simon. Simon is a 24-year-old and has been deconstructing his faith. The aspect of this deconstruction we want to talk about is how high demand Christian churches promote or define masculinity. Simon, welcome to the podcast. Is there anything else you want to say to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hello, I'm Simon. I grew up in a fundamentalist evangelical Baptist church with a Southern preacher. So it's a Southern Baptist, though I grew up in the Northeast, which is a little ironic. I go by any pronouns. It's not something that really matters to me. I consider myself to fit somewhere in the non-binary spectrum right now.
Okay. And can you describe for me and the audience how masculinity was presented to you by the church and the media your church promoted?
So it was very traditional. Men were supposed to be protectors, leaders, providers. Their authority was largely unquestioned, second only to God, but they were also the ones who were leading you in that spiritual journey. So
Okay.
basically, God, because you weren't allowed to question them. A lot of the authoritarian aspects were more heavily influenced because that's how you get people to do what you want, and that's how you lead, not with kindness or gentleness, with your words and your actions, giving people no other choice.
Yeah. So it's much more of a authoritative, I am in command, almost more militaristic.
Very much so. The military and police and any sort of authority figure like that were promoted and looked up to as a gold standard and not to be questioned.
Okay. And how did you feel growing up with these expectations?
I didn't like all the I never wanted that level of authority or control. That was
Okay.
not something that mattered to me. I also I don't deal with people telling me what to do and not giving me a reason why very well, which is, I think that's understandable. It also
Yeah.
shows the level of immaturity that they had, where if they just told me why, I would have done it, but they didn't think to let other people in the process.
And
Uh,
that's important because the problem with one of the problems with authoritarianism is they want unquestioned obedience. And if you've been through trauma or you've had people who betrayed you, that's impossible to do because your trust has already been violated.
yes, it's very much now it's at the point where words are meaningless. Show me with your actions, which is
Okay.
not, which is understandable, but not fair for everyone in every circumstance. So that's just another lingering aspect of this.
Yeah. So if this view of masculinity was not true to yourself, how did you manage to fit in or not fit into the community?
For most people, you found your niche and you did that. I tried to do that. I tried to find like what aspect or what area I could be authoritative in and control. It didn't work out. I'm not that type of person. So I tried to pick other aspects of the of masculinity, like a protector or like a pillar of stability, so that I could be there for people if they needed anything, and I would always be able to help someone out in that aspect. But that's not unique to masculinity. That's just
Yeah.
a general thing to be a good person, to be a friend, to be there if someone needs your help, and to always be willing to help if that's within your power.
Okay. So let's get a little deeper into how your church talked about masculinity. Were you allowed to wear shorts?
Yes, but growing up in a large family, um, everything in our wardrobe was very strict. So like we were allowed to, but we didn't because it was easier to buy something that, or to buy the same thing for everyone so that no one gets special treatment. And so everyone just ended up wearing like, well, all the guys, the t-shirt and blue jeans was the what we wore the whole time.
Okay. And in the circles of men in the area, were they in shorts, or did you ever see a guy in drag at church? Like,
No, at church it was very much like button down. Uh, you had a tie if you were in some sort of role in the church. If you weren't in a role in the church, you had like a polo or a button down, but very much traditionally like formal attire.
okay, okay. And the reason I'm trying to expand a little bit on what traditional is, because it's one thing for some people and it's not necessarily another thing for others. So in your growing up, you were expected as a man to get out of the home and have a job,
Yes.
correct? You wouldn't have been considered manly if you stayed home with the kids.
No, that was not. It was never explicitly said that that was wrong, but it was
Okay.
heavily implied by how people acted when they interacted with someone like that. That was always the women's job to stay home with the kids and be to do that side of parenting. And if you never saw the dad ever or then it was just proof of how hard they were working to provide for their family and not neglect, which it most likely is.
Yeah. Discipline, was that more the dad's job? I mean, obviously mothers have to discipline because they're home with the kids.
It
But was there
was
a, go ahead.
there was levels of discipline. If you had to wait for dad to get home from work, then you knew it was really bad because that was not something that mom would do herself.
Okay. In terms of discipline, was there spanking?
Yes.
And was that done by your father mostly?
If it was bad, it was, but most of it because there were a lot of us, most of it was done by my mom.
To nip it in the bud, so to speak.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things I read talked about men being conquerors. Was that something that you were brought up thinking of?
It was. There was very all of the men in the like the books and the stories that were promoted as good as what men should be like. They were all like heroes
Hmm.
and conquerors and and like generals and military leaders. It was very there wasn't a lot of opportunity for any other type of masculinity. It was just you go out and you do the dirty hard work because it's supposed to be done.
The limitations of women. What was that like growing up? So a woman wouldn't be working outside the home, generally speaking.
Yes.
Would a woman be fixing a car?
Only if they were trying to make a point, but generally no.
So that was kind of man's work.
Yes.
In terms of cleaning the house, was that every child's work, or was that women's work, or was that the whole family work?
It was all of us. There was no segregation in that aspect. We were
Okay.
all given a job to do, and if you didn't do it, then you got in trouble. It did rotate occasionally between what jobs you got, but that was for all of us. That's probably mostly because it's a large family.
Right. And everyone has to pitch in.
Yep.
Yeah, because sometimes traditional families were that women did all the housework, women did all the cooking, and men would be outside in the yard doing yard work, repairing things. So you guys didn't necessarily have that strict of a gender roles.
No, it did definitely take a little bit longer for the women to be able to go out and do the yard work. Like the men were definitely put on that job first, but we all
Okay.
pitched in at some point.
Okay. In the educational roles of the church, were women teaching men? adult men? Let me put it that way.
No, no.
Okay.
There weren't any women teachers, really. There weren't many teachers in general. But like if you wanted to lead like a Sunday school class, that would make there would women would do that, but those are also kids. And the adult Sunday school or like the adult equivalent of Sunday school was always done by the pastor or another male leader if they wanted to do that.
Okay. And some of that is, as kids, it may not be explicit, but you're seeing these patterns. Okay, dad gets to do, and I'm expected to be with dad, or mom gets to do X, Y, and Z, and my sisters have to be with mom.
Yeah.
Okay. And since some of these masculine ideas really didn't feel true to yourself, did you ever feel safe or a sense of belonging in church?
It was belonging was something I was always trying to do. So I guess the answer would be no, because that was always
Okay.
something I was trying to achieve. I don't really know. Like at the time, I felt safe, but that's
Okay.
because the authority structure tells you that if you don't question anything and if you do what they say, you'll be fine. And you also don't get in trouble if you don't question
Yeah.
authority. And at the time, I didn't. I had bought in. I was trying to do everything the right way as much as I could. So it at the time it was, but then looking back and seeing other people's experiences with it, it was very obvious to see how unsafe it was. I just didn't notice it at the time.
Right. And that's common because you're just in an environment, you're trying to grow up and learn and figure it out. It takes sometimes hindsight to see, oh,
Yeah.
this maybe shouldn't have happened.
And I had no other frame of reference to balance that
Yep.
perspective.
Yep.
This is the way I've always done it, so this is the way it should be done.
When you were growing up, did you ever hear messages that God was delighted with you as you are?
Yes, but it didn't really resonate with me because there was no
Okay.
action behind it.
Okay.
Because there would people would say constantly that God loves you for who you are, but then they would also villainize gay people and anyone who didn't fit in the box that they wanted. So they would say that they loved everyone, but their actions would not reflect that statement.
So you said that growing up, you heard people in church vilifying gay people, or was it more the media that the church promoted?
It was more the media that the church promoted because they would never like address that specifically, but it was always very heavily implied that there are two genders and the gender roles are clearly defined in the Bible and that this is what you're supposed to do in these scenarios. And anything that strayed from that very rigid structure was of the devil. That was said that it's like uh, it's the world and the flesh and the devil that's getting involved in making and so people aren't doing exactly what they thought the Bible had said.
So when someone says that, okay, a natural desire is of the devil, how do you think a child reacts to that?
I accepted it as the truth
Okay.
because I had nothing to balance it off of. I assume most kids probably do. They're I'm not sure how most people would. I accepted it because that's what I thought was the right thing to do at the time until I did more introspection and realized that the things that are of the devil applied to me, but I didn't feel like I was of the devil. So that was
Okay.
part of this whole deconstruction process was realizing that I fit in the categories that people thought were bad. And I didn't think I was a bad person. I tried very hard not to be a bad person. And if I couldn't do anything about if I couldn't do anything about that, then I'm doomed inherently. And that's not a state of living that is tenable.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not. I mean, so are you aware that left-handedness is in the Bible as a sin?
Yes, I do know that. Yeah.
Even though that's in the Bible as a sin, we know now that it's an thing. You're either born left-handed or you're born right-handed, and some people can use a little bit of both. But generally, it seems, for the most part, many progressive churches have kind of dropped that as a sin, because you can't condemn someone for something they can't choose or something that's not a chosen behavior. How did your church use that? Did they ignore left-handedness as a sin? Did they just keep going on and just focus on sexuality?
They ignored it. I didn't learn that until later in
Okay.
life. Evangelical churches love to pick and choose which rules that they more heavily enforce and which ones they don't.
Okay.
And they also like using the Old Testament, especially the laws and like Leviticus, to very stringently go down on certain aspects while ignoring uh like very other things which are focused on just as hard in those laws.
So like ignoring the Jubilee laws about restoring
Yes,
property to people and stuff like that. Yeah.
and how lending money is bad. You shouldn't, and interest is something that you
It's a
should never
sin.
do. Yeah,
Yeah. That's been ignored in capitalism.
very much so. Yes.
Yeah. So you had people saying, oh, you're loved by God. God's a loving father or a loving parent or a loving entity. Did anyone say, like, because you're created in God's image, you are loved? Like, that's a source of your worth?
No, as much as they like to say that works can't save you, they also wanted you to work for them. it, a lot of people found their self-worth in what they could do for the church, and as opposed to in their existence.
Okay. So there was a sense of proving your worth, not a sense of you're inherently worthy.
Yes.
Okay. So as you're deconstructing your faith and masculinity, how has the masculinity idea affected that deconstruction?
So it all kind of happened at the same time. It's when you have a rigid structure which you are
Mhm.
not allowed to get outside of. Like there are specific roles that you have to do, and you have to present yourself a certain way, and you have to operate a certain way in masculinity and in like general Christianity in general. Once you realize that like the rigidity isn't real and there's no reason for it, and it's harmful more than it is helpful in many aspects, then it breaks. Because if you're told that the Bible is a infallible, inerrant, holy word of God, then if there's the smallest little thing, which even if it doesn't, if someone can use apologetics to like make an explanation, if it's not real to you, or if that explanation doesn't work for you, then the whole thing is gone. Because if it's supposed to be a blanket statement for everything, and one thing doesn't fit, then it doesn't work for anything anymore. So you
Okay.
have to, so at that point, you have to either decide that you're going to stay in it and ignore all the problems that you're having, or you have to leave and like take a step back and figure out what you do want. And that all happened to me around 2020 during the pandemic, just trying to reevaluate, take a step back, I had more free time, figure out what I wanted, who I was. Uh, I had questions before, but I decided to ignore them until I was like, oh, I have time. I can do some research. I can see what other people say. I can get some opinions of Bible scholars and not just apologetics teachers.
Yeah. Well, and with the Bible scholars, because in college I had both a academic religion degree and an academic history degree, and all of that is deconstructing. You look at everything and say, is this really what Jesus would have said? Or is this the early community putting things into Jesus' mouth? You question it all. But in a more authoritative model that you were raised in, you weren't allowed to question anything.
They said we are allowed to question. but you can only question certain things that they had answers to. If you went into things that they didn't have answers to, then it was because that's what the Bible says, and that's as far as it went.
So if you have questions about, well, if someone is naturally gay, why are we condemning them?
Yes.
Like if this is a genetic thing, why are we condemning? And there's no answer for that.
I think the answer they tried to come up with was they still chose to live in that lifestyle as opposed to denying themselves. Once you've reached that point of like cognitive dissonance, then you've kind of lost everyone at that point, unless they really want that.
So instead of living a life that is honest and true to themselves, they have to lie to another human being and take a vow to that other human being and try and be as faithful as they can when they may not be attracted to that person.
Yes, that was the general, or remain single for the rest of your life.
Which is hard to do.
Yeah, especially in this economy.
Yeah, it really is hard to do. It's not because of the masculinity was so closely linked to patriarchy. Did you ever see did they ever highlight anything in the Bible that showed matriarchy?
No, the only the only times that people really talked about women in the Bible were like the obvious examples of like Ruth and Esther, where they use
Mm-hmm.
a system for their own gain, as opposed to like doing like breaking the system and saying like this is kind of a problem. He's
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah, I'm laughing a little bit because as Ruth comes into play around the same time that Jonah does as a commentary against the exclusionary rules of Ezra and Nehemiah coming back to Israel. And so it's a countercultural narrative. It's interesting to hear that, oh, this is the women gaming the system for their own needs rather than the revolutionary aspect of, no, Jesus, David, King David isn't purely Jewish, which was the point of Ruth.
yeah.
Or that Jonah got sent to our enemies and had the only successful sermon in the Bible, and they repented, and Jonah was pissed off.
Yeah. I
So,
never looked at that like that before.
yeah, the undercurrent of the text.
It's as
Uh,
a side note, is also very funny that the only women given names and mentioned in the Bible are harlots, or also have harlot as a title for them.
Sometimes, though, Mary Magdalene isn't a harlot,
That's
even
true.
though that's comes later as a way of diminishing her role.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
There was
there's a lot in there that you see the power struggle between men and women in there. When Israel is more agrarian and men are working more with women, there is more respect for women. But when it becomes more urbanized and men are removed from the home economics, that becomes women's territory and men's territory becomes more elevated. I don't think that's just limited to the Bible, but that's kind of an aspect of things. When you see how hard your partner is working, it's harder to denigrate that person.
yeah.
And when you work together in tandem, you can learn to appreciate each other. If you could influence pastors and or churches on how to present masculinity to young people, what would you say?
I would put everyone experiences and presents masculinity uniquely to them.
Mhm.
And so don't put a box around yourself and other people. Like it's very unique in the way that like everyone was raised differently. Even if you have a similar upbringing, you internalized it differently and experienced different aspects of it. So don't shut someone down instantly for something that you don't like or it's foreign to you. You need to hear people out and be like caring and kind in that aspect. Because they might be doing this something you don't like for attention. And if you give
Mhm.
them positive attention and reinforce the good behaviors, then you can help them grow. And maybe that, like, even as a manipulation tactic, they'll stop what they're doing. So like being kind is good always. Because even if you're doing it for nefarious purposes, positive outcomes can come from it.
And being kind is part of the biblical mandate from Jesus.
Yes. So to
How do
love
you
everyone.
were you raised with images of like this ultra masculine Jesus who almost looks like he could take on a worldwide West wrestling personality at all?
I Not really. There weren't a lot of depictions of Jesus. Part of that was from the curriculum being mostly Mennonite or have some
Okay.
aspects from it where you're not allowed to have any depictions of Jesus because then people would worship that as opposed to worshiping Jesus. At least that was the idea that they said. So there weren't a lot of depictions. He was definitely portrayed more as like the conqueror going into Jerusalem before he was crucified. Everyone was like it was emphasized that he was going in as a conqueror, but then like switched, be like, no, I'm not trying to conquer, I'm trying to save. But they always but the saving is also conquering. It's just I'm doing a different method as opposed to like bringing an army to overthrow the Roman Empire and to free us. I'm now saving everyone.
Can can you say more about that? I'm giving you a very confused look.
Jesus's meekness was never highlighted. It was
Okay.
only unless it was in how he washed the feet of his disciples and that
Okay.
whole interaction, how he like telling Peter that he would deny him 3 times, and that whole scenario in the Bible. That was the only thing where it was like you saw like the human side of Jesus growing up,
Mm-hmm.
and everything else, it was like even though they said he wasn't there, and even though the pastors and the teachers said that Jesus was not there to overthrow the Roman Empire and to conquer, they use that same language in how and what his sacrifice on the cross did for us. Like it wasn't a thing purely out of meekness and love. It was also a conquering thing as well. And that was the language they used was very similar to what the the people of Israel wanted at the time from Jesus and what he didn't fulfill for them. Very pointedly didn't fulfill.
Okay. So you didn't grow up hearing that the cross is a sign of God's strength, that the strength of Jesus in is and the strength of God is seen in weakness, is paradoxical to the world's power structures.
No, it wasn't. There weren't a lot of paradoxes. Like it was
Okay.
very much this is what this means, and it is very straightforward and easy to understand if you don't have a large grasp of the world, but falls apart as soon as you learn more.
Okay. So in circles with your where you were raised, were men encouraged to seek political appointments or to influence politicians?
To a degree, no one was connected enough to be able to do that, but it
Okay.
was always seen as like a noble goal and something that you should, if ever there was someone who even pretended or said with no action that they were Christian, they were given a high seat of honor within like the way, at least the way that the church talked about them. Like you didn't even have to say anything or do anything to prove it. You could just like hint at it or like say you are, and then you were like given a stamp of approval and talked about in that way.
Okay. Okay. Because I'm interested in the power dynamics because so when Christianity becomes embedded in the secular power structures, it often can be abusive. I
Yeah.
mean, we've seen that throughout all of history. And I think we need as churches and as religious leaders to understand and acknowledge that And we're in a time in our life right now where we see a group of people actively seeking to control politics through religion. And the Christian nationalists or the religious nationalists are not what I would consider Christian because of how they use power and control. But it seems to be very patriarchal. Do you feel like what you see going on with the Christian nationalism is that akin to what you were kind of taught to believe?
They are definitely pushing the same ideas that were pushed in the church I grew up in. A lot
Okay.
of people who I knew from the church, they would agree with what is happening mostly. I don't know if they I don't know if they would be self-aware enough to realize that most people don't like that, so they would never say it out loud. But they definitely, in the way they act and what they say, imply that that's something that they would have agree with and something that they voted for. And a lot of them do end up being single issue voters. Like abortion is very important for them. If you were anti-abortion, then they got their vote pretty easily.
Okay. Yeah. And the nuances around abortion as the only way to end a pregnancy, miscarriage and all that stuff isn't widely talked about in those circles, is it?
No, because that's not because the men are in charge and men don't have to deal with that. So they're not going to think about it and they're just going to make a blanket statement to try to fix the problem as opposed to actually listening to their wives about what's going on and what's actually important in that situation.
And many of the men, I'm assuming, have never sat there with their wives and found out at 20 weeks that the baby is not viable.
Not to my knowledge, no. I can't say that that never happened, but given their actions, I would doubt it.
Yeah. Because that's just a heartbreaking reality for many couples, and where kindness and compassion really need to be exercised.
Yeah.
When you were deconstructing your faith, or when you started on that deconstruction journey, what were resources that you found helpful that you would encourage others to use?
So I was on TikTok a lot, and there are a lot of TikTok apologetics or people on TikTok doing apologetics. And then there's also a lot of people who will just hear someone's statement or Bible scholars, or that is like their life. And they
Mm-hmm.
go and they say, no, this is not actually what Jesus was talking about. Like we go back, or even like the Old Testament, we go back to the earliest manuscripts we have. It's not interpreted this way. And basically, not to show that there are contradictions in the Bible, but to show that it isn't what you want. Like the Bible is read, you are reading the Bible the way you want to read the Bible, as opposed to
Yeah.
how it is written. And that's not fair. And even contradictions in the Bible are fine because the Bible was not written to have one thought through like concrete thought throughout the whole thing. It was written by a bunch of different people throughout a lot of time and a lot of cultures and situations.
Yep.
And that was very helpful to realize that like the thoughts I had about the Bible, because I interpreted it a certain way, which was different than how the spiritual leaders had interpreted it. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
okay. You can disagree. That's fine. That doesn't have to ruin your faith until you get to talking to spiritual leaders about it, and they don't allow for that type of fluidity, even though it's very marginal. Some people who helped with that, well, there's people on TikTok. Dan McClellan is probably my favorite. Someone will make an inflammatory statement about some religious text, and he
Mm-hmm.
will just like, okay, let's talk about it. That's not actually very calm, very much like, hey, this is not right. He's not trying to evangelize. He's trying to share information, which is very helpful because everyone else is trying to evangelize in some aspect.
How is evangelism? How is your experience of evangelism? Is it more here's the information, take and do what you want with it, or is it more you must believe the way I do?
It was mostly this is what I believe. You should believe this also. It it was at the point where with the church where like we would go door knocking or like leave like tracts or invitations at people's houses until like someone told us to leave because that's technically soliciting and that's not allowed in these
Right.
neighborhoods. At the end, like near the end of that for me was realizing that like with all good intentions, I don't want any of these people to come to this church because it's just dysfunctional in the way that it's being run, regardless of its beliefs and opinions. But like there's no there's no merit, there's no reason to be here. Like this, you're not doing anything helpful or productive. So I stopped doing evangelism and I kind of stopped like using that as something to describe me because it's not
Right.
this isn't helpful to anyone. Like if you wanted to be good, like God told us to show his love by our love for one another and to go
Mhm.
out into the community and to do good works, not to tell someone to come to our church and then for them to ultimately be disappointed by how dysfunctional and how poorly run and just how behind the times we were.
Okay. And one of the aspects we talked earlier about the dysfunction was the fact that all the men were supposed to be leaders. And so you had a lot of men trying to vie for their special interest.
Yes, everyone thought that their particular area of leadership was more important and tried to push it in a certain direction, or they just disregarded what the authority said or wanted and did their own thing. That happened there. That happened a little too often.
Right.
They wanted a specific new thing that was supposed to help them out with whatever aspect they were doing, and they did it without getting approval or even asking someone else's opinion.
Okay. Yeah. A lot of America uses sports analogies and teamwork for functioning in larger groups. Was that ever used as an analogy of like, who's the team captain and this is the team we're playing for? We're playing for Team Jesus and we're going to go help the world this way. Was that ever used as an analogy?
It was, but nothing came of it.
Okay.
It was a mainly a rallying cry for more money for missionaries. That was it was used
Okay.
as a way to uh, to push missions as opposed to actually do something good for the community.
Okay. So you are now deconstructing your faith. You talked about finding some things in Buddhism that you find really interesting. Where do you think you're going to end up on this journey, or what are you looking at right now? More universalism, more progressive Christianity, chucking Christianity completely to something totally different?
It it all depends on how Christianity grows within the next couple years.
Mm,
Because I'm not willing to throw out all of Christianity because that's unfair to the good elements and to everyone
mhm.
who's in it. But there is definitely a lot of growth that needs to happen within the church and within the people in the church. Right now, I am more of a I like centering things around like my experience with other people and what people tell
Mhm.
me.
Mhm.
So it's I've been able to develop a moral compass to the point where if I see something, I can recognize that it might be a problem. And even if I don't know it, I trust that. So I go and try to do more research and to like interrogate that thought, be like, why is this bothering me? And if it's something that I need that is a problem with me and I need to change something, that I'm more than willing to like go through that process and get other people's opinion. That seems like it should be something that everyone does to some extent. And if like it's difficult to say Christianity as a blanket statement because there are many different facets to it, and people like people worship differently, people express their faith differently. Because so it's hard for me to like what is true Christianity? Is it what the Bible teaches, or is it what the people do? And what
Mhm.
aspect like what is like what who can be called Christian? Because are they following the Bible and so they're Christian, or do they say they're Christian so they're Christian? So I think it needs to grow. People need to get, and if they do grow, then I'm willing to come back, but it's going to take time, and
Yeah.
people need to show maturity, and I haven't seen that very often.
Yeah. How are you open to looking at more progressive forms of Christianity?
I am. There's still a lot of they still say a lot of the buzzwords, which are
Yeah.
not, which just give me are triggering. I don't want to
Yeah.
hear the same buzzwords over and over again. They might mean different things to you, but I'm not fully over that. I don't know if I ever will be.
Yep.
I
Yeah. That's fair.
I've
Yeah, that's
had
fair.
I've gone to other churches which claim to be more progressive, but it just means that they don't sing hymns from the 1800s. They have more modern worship songs. That's ultimately the biggest difference.
Okay, when I think about progressive churches, I'm thinking that they are openly talking about reconciliation and welcoming gay and lesbian persons, and reparations is talked about. Racism is not shoved under the carpet, but work work towards healing in that aspect of things. Have you found any churches like that, or communities like that?
I haven't. I also haven't looked very hard,
Okay.
because most of the suggestions that I've gotten are from other like fundamentalists, evangelicals. So I don't listen to their suggestions. I like, oh, that's
Yeah.
nice, and try not to offend, but also I'm definitely not going to that church. But haven't done, I haven't looked for anything more right now. I've tried to like the biggest thing the church did for me growing up was having a community.
Yeah.
Um, and that's probably the biggest that in my opinion, that's the best function a church can hold, is to be there for the community, and to just have a bunch of people around you are who believe similar things, but more so are just like trying to be together and help each other out when they need it. And I've been able to find that community other places. So
Yeah.
it's not necessary for me to go to church, because
Yeah.
if that's what I'm going for, and it's like the communities aren't as strong as they like to say they are, and communities not being as strong as they like to say they are, juxtaposed against like all the buzzwords which are triggering, like it's not a useful situation for me right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And it may not be. I mean, that's the challenge with reconstructing faith, is what do you throw out and what do you keep? I like to remind people too that as a human being, no matter how well I try and live out my Christianity, I'm going to disappoint you. I mean, that's just the reality of life. The more stressed out I am, the less patient I am, the less tolerance I have, and the more likely I am to snap at somebody. And in living in Christian community, it's a minefield of people trying and failing sometimes to be the grace-centered people we're supposed to be. And that makes it hard. There's a sense of, well, then how do we work through our failings and faults? Because as the more I've grown as an adult, the more I've realized, oh, my parents didn't really know what they were doing, and they weren't really well prepared for how the world has changed. And we have seen so much change that I'm not sure I'm very prepared for the way the world has changed. And it makes it
That
hard. Yeah.
that I think that's true for most generations. And
Yeah.
like the piece of advice that I would give, having no experience on the matter, um, is you just need to be honest about that. Like if you don't know, say I don't know. I'm just doing my best here. And that's like, as a church leader, people don't like to hear that answer, because
No, because
it's
they're
not
looking for certainty in their church leader sometimes. Yeah.
yes. But if you just say, hey, like these are some options. I don't know what's a good one. Let's do this together. That's that brings your community together so much more because you're in it together and you're trying together and it's not one person telling you what to do the whole time. You do lose some security when you do that because
Yeah.
you are aware of the unknowns and people don't like that. But it all I think it's better in the long run, no matter what.
From mostly what I've heard from younger generations and what our research has talked about with younger generations is they appreciate vulnerability. What I found though is our older generations are not as comfortable with vulnerability.
Yeah.
And that creates, when you try and have a community with 6 generations of people together, there's naturally going to be some conflict in that. And what I've also found is that not a lot of people are comfortable with conflict, myself included.
Yes. They're the people who invite conflict, so they want it. So they go and out
Yeah,
fighting as hard as they can, and no one likes that person or no one wants to deal with that person. So they
yeah,
just they end up bullying their way into getting whatever they want because no one wants to deal with that.
yeah. That definitely leads to a lot of unhealthy aspects in churches.
Yes.
Um, and it's not something that just one person in the church can fix. It has to be a bunch of people saying, "This is not the values that we want here."
Yes.
And I don't know that we've really equipped. I don't feel very equipped. Let me put it in this terms. I don't feel very equipped as Gen X to say that because we were not allowed to question a lot of things.
Yeah.
There's a reason grunge exists.
I I feel like in order for me to come back to the church, a new generation of church leaders would have to come up because I don't see the current generation being as a whole being okay with questioning things that are like core to who they are as a person.
Mhm.
Because a lot of at least the older church leaders have been living with this perspective for their entire life. And if you're like 50s, 60s, that's a that's like years of their life, which is now gone if they question something. And you'll think that you'll feel like you're living a lie and that your life has been wasted because something so drastic and so fundamental, something that you put all your like the basket you put all your coins in, you realize
Mhm.
has some holes in it. And I don't know if it's fair to ask people to like fundamentally shake their life up in that way. So it's another reason why I'm not a fan of evangelism. Because if you're not
Yeah,
willing to change yourself, then you shouldn't be asking someone else to change for as well.
yeah. The thing that I've always felt was disingenuous in some forms of evangelism is assuming that because you're raised in a certain church, you're not Christian.
Yeah.
And that, oh, because you were baptized as an infant, you are going to hell. That type of thing. Because I've literally had people tell me that. Or that because I'm a female pastor, I'm leading people astray. And never once getting to know myself or the people that I've served, or that, yeah, I'm not perfect as a pastor. I'm very flawed. I don't feel like I do a good job of this, but it's also very overwhelming. You're dealing with so many balls in the air. There's only a little bit, like you're moving a battleship and it only moves in increments. So the church itself, I think, is a flawed institution. I just don't know what to replace it with. That's one of the challenges too.
Yeah.
And it's part of the reason why I like doing these conversations with you all, is because you're coming at things from a different perspective. And it challenges me to think differently in terms of, okay, well, how can we make church more accommodating for people? How can we help our communities understand that 50, 60 years ago you may have been able to support a family on one job, but now you can't? And how do we get that reality? And then if we have resources that can make life a little easier for the next generation, what resources are those, and how can we get people to know that? Like, to me, that's kind of like, that's how I'd like to see churches kind of operate, is more of a, what has changed? What's going on with folks? How can we walk together? And do we have options to help people make the transition, especially from the transition from high school to working world or college to working world is a really rough transition. What can we offer or help? And initially that's what I would love to see churches do more of. It's
My
just, go ahead.
my proposal for like churches in general is to go out and try to earn their tax exempt status. Like do something in the community to merit having that. Like open a soup kitchen, like do like daycare for kids. Do something that would be a positive influence on the community so that you operate as if you are like so you can go to the government and say, hey, we're doing good things for our community. We're like a necessary staple of this community. I don't think we should pay taxes. Like that, I think that should be a good thing. Instead, as opposed to just like we can do whatever we want now. We can put everything, you can put our pastor's private jet in the name of the church and not have to pay anything on it. Like
That's an
go
abuse of tax. That wouldn't
yeah.
fly with my tax accountant because that's abusive. I
It
mean, that,
is.
yeah, there are certain things that, and again, no, so the mega churches are 3% of US churches and 25% of US population who's worshiping goes to 3% of churches, the mega churches. So they have an oversized impact on what people see as church.
Yeah.
And for the rest of us, the 97% of the rest of us, we may have 50 members in our congregations on a Sunday. We may be struggling to pay our bills. We may do a daycare and a soup kitchen and are worried that the volunteers to help run it are no longer there. And it's a very different aspect. But
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like a lot of times, like there are times when I want to say, well, yeah, tax the mega churches, ask them what they're doing in the communities, and leave us struggling ones who are trying to help.
It, at
Leave
the end of
leave the baggage they've created
at the end of the
outside.
day, it all comes back to Reaganomics. You tax
Yeah.
the wealthy and you leave the people who need the money. The people who need the money can keep it.
Well, and that's what Reaganomics killed,
Yeah.
because there was a time when you wouldn't see a company making $20 billion and still paying starvation wages. So
Yep.
another aspect of another thing. If you want to hear Simon and I solve the economic issues of the world, we'll do that in another podcast because we can go off on that. I I think I'm going to wrap up a little bit, but first, Simon, I want to thank you for being willing to talk about gender and expectations placed on you growing up. I found growing up as a girl in the 1970s and 80s very frustrating because I was often told, oh, you can't do that, you're a girl. And I was like, I'm going to do it anyway. I'm much more comfortable if we raise people to be kind human beings, regardless of whether they're male or female. I think that sometimes it can be traumatizing to have narrow expectations of men that are not holistic, that don't acknowledge that men do have emotions and that men do have caring sides, and that men are just as capable as women of caring for children, and that we all have natural gifts that are given to us regardless of gender identity or assigned gender at birth. I appreciate your willingness to verbalize and share your experiences. Again, as a Gen Xer, I find I am reactive to labels and do not want to be defined. I find too that I need to listen to the younger generations who have spent a lot of time expanding what gender is, what identity is, and in many ways doing things I never even thought about. So when you talk about non-binary, we didn't really go through that much, but that's something that, yeah, you guys are exploring, and however that leads you, good for you. Be yourself. And I want to remind us, older folks, that asking a young person about their pronouns and how they wish to be addressed is not a bad thing. It's an acknowledgement of the person's identity and work they have gone through in understanding who they are. And it's just respectful. We don't have to understand everything as an adult with our younger folks, but we can walk beside them and respect the choices they are making, how they identify themselves, and how they're adjusting to this world that is very topsy-turvy. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you would like to participate or learn more, you can reach out to us at condemnedhappy@gmail.com. That's condemnedhappy@gmail.com. We are on social media under Condemned and Happy on Facebook, Threads, and Instagram. We also have 2 blogs, one at condemnedhappy@blogspot.com and the other at WordPress as Condemned Happy. Thank you, Simon, and thank you to our listeners. Have a great day.